What happened when Jean McConville, a 38-year-old mother of 10, was dragged from her home in Belfast, never to be seen again? Patrick Radden Keefe will tell us about this central mystery from the time of the Troubles and his new book, Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland. What do we know about animal emotions and how they are different and the same from our own? Frans Waal will be here to talk about his latest book, Mama's Last Hug, Animal Emotions and What They Tell Us About Ourselves. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Patrick Radden Keefe joins us from Washington. His new book is Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland. Patrick, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you became interested in this story in one of my personal favorite ways for authors to become interested in stories. It happens more often than one might think. Tell us about how you first became interested in the subject of your book.
Well, it was on the obituary page of the New York Times. In 2013, I stumbled across an obituary, and it was one of those obituaries that just cracks open a whole world that you had very little kind of inkling of beforehand. A woman named Dolores Price had died, and she had been an IRA soldier. She joined the IRA in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s, and she'd lived a very dramatic life. And I was so intrigued by her story and some of the little details in this obituary that I wanted to see where it went.
Like, what was it that got you?
Well, it was a few things. So she had been the first woman to join the IRA as a real frontline soldier, kind of leading bombing raids and targeting people for execution and things like that. And she had come from a very traditional kind of IRA family and grew up indoctrinated in this sense that if you were Irish, you had a duty to expel the British from Ireland by any means necessary. And she was just kind of a very dramatic, impetuous figure who had taken part in some very famous operations and had gone to prison and gone on hunger strike and kind of faced down Margaret Thatcher and married a movie star, and then later in life became quite disaffected. And one of the details in this obituary was that it mentioned a famous case, a case I had not known about, but a case that was very famous in Ireland, of a woman named Jean McConville who was murdered in 1972, a mother of 10. And the connection between these two women, which was right there in that obituary, struck me as really interesting and a way to possibly tell a larger story.
All right, well, you don't start with that connection at the beginning of your book. That's revealed later on.
Yeah, well, that was deliberate. I mean, as I pushed into this case of this woman, Jean McConville, who was a widow and a mother of 10 and had been abducted in front of her children and disappeared, she was secretly buried, so the children never knew what had happened to her. I realized that it pulled together the lives of a handful of people, not just Dolores Price, but both victims and perpetrators. And so I thought that might be a kind of frame through which to tell this story and look at the impact of that one act of violence on these different people. So in the book, in terms of the storytelling, I didn't want to reveal that right away at all. And I think
I was going to say to people, don't read the obituary first if you want to read the book, because it really unfolds like a mystery, and you're very deliberate with your construction of the narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there's a vast literature of books on the Troubles, and I've read a great many of them at this point, but I find a lot of that literature a little bit forbidding. And so part of what I was trying to do was tell this very much as a narrative and approach it the way you would approach a novel rather than a history book, in the sense that there are big events in the history of the Troubles that hardly rate at all in my book because they didn't affect the handful of characters that I chose to be writing about. So I really only wanted to see this story through the points of view of this half a dozen or so people.
Well, the novelistic quality of the book is something that reviewers have pointed out in terms of the characterization, the pacing, and also this central mystery. So let's start with that, with Jean McConville. What happened to her?
So one winter night in late 1972, she was at home in West Belfast in a big, vast housing project where she lived, and she had 10 kids. Her husband had died earlier that year, and one evening there was a knock at the door, and a gang of masked people burst inside, and they had guns, and they dragged her out in front of her kids, and they told the kids, "We just want to take her away for a few hours. We want to talk to her, but we'll bring her back. And she left, and the kids never saw her again. And we know now that it was the IRA that took her away and ended up killing her and burying her in an unmarked grave. But her children didn't know. So initially they stayed in the apartment thinking that they had to be there because she'd eventually come back.
Was there anything in her life up to that point that indicated that she might be an obvious target for the IRA?
It depends on who you ask. So what the IRA eventually said about this case, which again, Jean McConville's not a household name here, but in Ireland, this is one of the most iconic victims of the Troubles, was that she had been an informer for the British Army. And her family really strenuously denies that. There are people who are really convinced of both sides. If you look at her life, though, I mean, what her children say is she had 10 kids. She was recently widowed. She was taking pills. She'd tried to commit suicide. She was in and out of a psychiatric hospital. She was not a master spy. The contention of the IRA is that she had been observing goings-on in this housing project where she lived, which happened to be a stronghold of the IRA, and passing that information along to the British Army for money.
So there are a number of characters in the book, but obviously there are these two central figures, Dolores Price and Jean McConville, both of them dead when you start writing. How did you go about bringing them to life? Because they're so vivid in the book.
Thank you. I mean, it was slow going. I should say, I mean, in my day job at The New Yorker, I think probably about half the pieces I do are what we call write-arounds, where you don't have access to the central figure. And so over the years, I've devised a fair number of, I mean, tricks isn't really the right word, but
do reveal all your tricks.
Techniques, let's say. So in the beginning of the book, there's a sequence in which Dolores Price and her sister, when they're teenagers, go on a protest, kind of peaceful protest march, actually inspired by the March on Selma. In 1969, they marched from Belfast to Derry to protest civil rights injustices for Catholics in Northern Ireland. And the march gets ambushed. So Dolores Price is dead, and there were a few times in her life when she referred to what happened to her on this march. And so I started with those. And then it's a question of, well, who else was on the march and have they written about it? And so I find their recollections. And then what contemporary newspaper accounts were there? Were there reporters along for the march? So I get those. Were there photographers there? Was there archival footage? I get those. Were there other people who were on that march who are still alive who remember Dolores Price and can tell me about the experience? I get those. And eventually what I did was I went to the place where the ambush happened. I didn't, I mean, it was a 60-mile march, so I didn't walk the whole thing. But I did go to the scene where this kind of climactic ambush towards the end happens. And with all of those different pieces of source information, I'm able to stitch together something that hopefully the surface of it feels quite smooth when you're reading it, but it's cobbled together from very disparate sources.
Jean McConville had 10 children. Are they all still alive, and did you talk to all of them?
I didn't talk to all of them, no, and a number of them have died. I spent a lot of time talking with 3 of them, and one in particular, Michael McConville, who is featured somewhat more than some of the others in the book. Her children, as you'd imagine, have had experiences of just unbelievable trauma. I mean, watching their mother taken away, and then what happened was that the government came in and said, no, we have to put you in an orphanage. And the kids said, okay, well, at least let us stay together. Let us all be together. And the government split them up. And they ended up in these awful kind of predatory orphanages in Northern Ireland, and some of them were abused physically and sexually. So this is a family that to this day has had to contend with just a huge amount of trauma. That made these conversations intense and difficult, but I've tried to tell their story with as much fidelity and respect as I can. And I should say, in the book, you find out what happened to Jean McConville. I reveal quite precisely the circumstances of her death and what went into that. And in doing that, I'm drafting on an incredibly brave effort by her children, starting in the 1990s, to come out and break the code of silence in Ireland and say, we need to know what happened to our mother. We've been waiting decades for answers, for a body. And I think it took great courage for them to do that.
There's also this other great body of evidence, the Belfast Project. Can you tell us about that?
There was this big controversy brewing, which is that Dolores Price had taken part in a secret oral history project at Boston College in which former combatants from the Troubles talked about all of the different things they'd done. And this was a kind of a risky bid by people affiliated with Boston College to put together a kind of first-person history of the Troubles in which paramilitaries discuss the murders they committed, the bombings, the war crimes they took part in. And that ended up being a kind of secret resource, and the idea was that it would only be unsealed when the participants were dead. But it didn't work out that way. And part of what Say Nothing is about is the kind of spectacular fashion in which that all unraveled, in which the authorities in Northern Ireland learned that there was this secret archive of reminiscences by ex-terrorists across an ocean in Boston.
I mean, it's almost amazing that it happened in the first place. How do they justify that? How do they find the people to talk to, get them to talk? And what's the legality around that it would then not be revealed? Because not all of these crimes that they described had necessarily been punished, right?
Very few of them had been. And this was part of what fascinated me about this story, is that there had been this real culture of silence in Northern Ireland throughout the Troubles. Then in 1998, you get this peace deal, and there was a fair degree of euphoria and a sense that, there's a new future and things are going to work out. And it was during that period that this project was hatched. But at the time, they knew that there was something radioactive about these reminiscences. And so as a result, they kept the project very, very secret. So all of these interviews were done in secret. When the interviews were finished, they would hand carry them back to Boston. People were communicating on encrypted email. There was a real sense that you couldn't have people find out about this. But I think I think we see this kind of thing play out in other areas in life too. If you have too small a group of people who know about something, there's not always the tendency to kind of troubleshoot and kick the tires in the way that you should. And so they never lawyered it as carefully as perhaps they should have. So they were essentially making guarantees to these people. You can give us these recordings in which you talk about these things you've done, and we guarantee you that it won't come out until you're dead. But that, it turns out, legally was a guarantee that they couldn't make. And indeed, part of what happens at the end of the book is we learn that some of these recordings end up in the hands of the police in Northern Ireland.
Are they still otherwise closed off? You can't simply, as a researcher, go and access and listen to them?
No, I mean, it's this awful irony, right? So the intention at the beginning was, if you think about any post-conflict situation, there's truth, there's reconciliation, there's accountability, there's all these kind of competing imperatives that you have when you look back in a situation like the Troubles at a scenario in which 3,600 people are killed and many more wounded, and how do we deal with that? The intention of what they called the Belfast Project, this secret archive at Boston College, was that this wasn't about accountability. This was about truth. We want to create a record that scholars and journalists can pore over in the future in order to just tell people, here's what happened. Here's what happened to these victims. Here's who took part. Here's why they did it. And it's not about helping the police bring people to trial and face justice. The outcome has ended up being almost exactly the opposite of that, which is that journalists and scholars are never going to have access now to this archive.
Why?
Because it became essentially a kind of political weapon. The police in Northern Ireland ended up subpoenaing the archive. And the authorities in the U.S., including federal judges, said that a lot of these recordings had to be turned over. And now the police are using them to investigate people. So at this stage, it's very difficult for anybody to actually get access, anybody like me who wants to write a book or an article to get access to these. But the cops and prosecutors can.
This is your third book. You wrote a book, Chatter, about the world of global eavesdropping, a book about the Chinatown underworld called The Snakehead, and you've just announced another book coming on the Sacklers, which was the subject of a piece you did for The New Yorker in 2017. How do you sort of decide, okay, this is more than just a story for the magazine. This is something that I want to spend, say, 3 or 4 years going into?
I'm still figuring it out, to be honest with you. My first book was different, Chatter, but The Snakehead started as a piece in The New Yorker, and Say Nothing did as well. And I think it's that moment when you get to the end of a piece, and it can be quite a long piece. So the piece that I published in The New Yorker in 2015 about Dolores Price and Jean McConville, that was a 15,000-word article. But I had this very profound sense as I got to the end that there were things I didn't know that I wanted to, and that there were stories that I thought I would have liked to tell. Even in 15,000 words, there wasn't room for. So I think it's a combination of things. For me, are the characters compelling enough that I want to spend more time with them and would hope that a reader would? Are the narrative bones good enough that they can sustain the story over hundreds of pages? And then is the material there? So with the Sacklers, I wrote this piece about 18 months ago for The New Yorker about this family that is widely known as a big philanthropic family, but it turns out that most of their fortune comes from OxyContin, and in some ways they could be said to have helped kind of spark the opioid crisis. The question came up after the piece came out whether or not there was a book there, and at the time I didn't think there was because the characters were fascinating, the story seemed urgent and important, but I just wasn't sure that I could get into the black box of what was happening within the Sackler family and their relationship with the company. But as it happened, the Attorney General of Massachusetts took an interest in this case and in the Sacklers in particular, and she has subpoena power, which I don't. And she proceeded to subpoena 1 million documents from the company.
You've got your work cut out for you.
I do.
Wow. Well, we've managed to talk without revealing any of the central sort of mysteries and reveals in this book. So I will go against my own interests as a New York Times journalist, tell people do not read the obituary until you read the book. The book, again, is Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. Patrick, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Frans de Waal joins us from Atlanta. He is the author of Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?, a recent bestseller, and his new book is called Mama's Last Hug, Animal Emotions and What They Tell Us About Ourselves. Frans, thanks so much for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
So your last book really looked at animal intelligence, and you went from there to animal emotions. Was that a kind of logical transition, or what led you to write this book?
Oh, I think animal intelligence and emotions are completely intertwined. Also in humans, I think you cannot separate the two. You can barely think without emotions, I think, and you can barely have emotions if there's not some cognition involved. But I separated these two issues because animal intelligence is nowadays a very accepted topic, and for the last 25 years, there's many people working on animal cognition and doing very, very wonderful stuff that we see every week, basically, on the internet. But animal emotions remains a bit of a taboo topic, not so much under the neuroscientists who, of course, study fear in rats and things like that. But the behavioral scientists are still very reluctant to touch the emotions. And so I felt it deserved a separate book.
I mean, when you're growing up as a child, at least when I was growing up, when you would see an animal have or seem to have some kind of emotional reaction, you would be told by the teacher, the parent, the authority, the people who know, no, that's just instinct. That's not emotion.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that way of thinking?
Yeah, it's funny that kids have a better understanding of animals sometimes than the adults, I think. The adults are trained at universities or other places to be not anthropomorphic and not to put too much into the behavior of animals and to keep their distance and explain it away like saying it is an instinct, which really doesn't help in any way to explain what the animal is doing. The adults are trained to stay away from internal states in animals, and we don't talk about thinking, we don't talk about feeling. And kids often have a more intuitive understanding. And I think we are now returning to that intuitive understanding because for about a century we were not allowed to talk about it. But now, finally, the doors are open again for that. What
is it that actually distinguishes that instinct from emotion in an animal?
Instinct is usually used for a pre-programmed reaction, like under certain conditions, like you smell this, then you have to do that, or you see a predator, then you do this. So it's basically a pre-programmed reaction to a stimulus. emotions are more complex and actually much more interesting, because emotions prepare you for action, but they don't produce the action. The emotion, let's say you see a predator and you freeze. But you can also run away, and you can also try to fight the predator. So the options that you have in front of you are based on your experiences and what you think is going to work under the circumstances. And so emotions prepare you for action, like an escape interaction or maybe an attraction to someone. The emotions prepare you, but they don't dictate your behavior one-on-one. And in that sense, they're much more flexible and much more interesting.
Our understanding of emotions in human beings has become much more nuanced in recent years as we've kind of seen or gotten a greater understanding of the role of hormones, of sort of how physiological emotions can be. Is that true also in animals? I mean, are animals also having these releases of dopamine and oxytocin, and is it that a kind of complex interplay in them as well?
Absolutely. Everything we know basically about these hormones comes from animal studies, and they're essentially the same. So under stress, cortisol goes up. Under bonding, oxytocin goes up. Very much the same as in humans. And so that's also why it would be so surprising if the emotions in animals would be so different, because the whole physiology and the whole neurology of them is exactly the same. So yes, we learn more and more about these states, and basically emotions are bodily states. The emotions are, because people sometimes think that you can reduce them to feelings, but it is really on the interface between the body and the mind. When you get emotional, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, you get hotter, your voice changes. There's all sorts of bodily changes. The stomach is very important, the digestive system. You have pain in your stomach if you're tense and so on. So your whole body changes. And these bodily changes are very much the same in humans and animals. And so, for example, we say we get cold feet when we're afraid. And actually, this has been tested. People do literally get cold feet when they see some scary image. But, rats, they get cold feet too, and their tail gets cold, because basically what fear does is withdraw blood from the extremities where it is not needed and put it in places where it is needed. And that's the fear reaction, and it's very much the same in humans and animals.
You're terrifying me because I have cold feet all the time, and now I think I just must be perpetually terrified. But how do we know? I mean, how do we know that some of these human emotions exist in animals? I'm calling them human emotions. How do we know that these emotions, whether animal or human, exist in some animals? I mean, in apes, for example, we can sort of see it. It feels obvious to us. It feels intuitive, or in a dog. But how do we know that, say, a starfish or a rat, or, I mean, you gave that one example with the feet, but how do we know with some of these animals where it just it's not obvious? Is it through hormones, or are there other ways of discerning?
So in animals close to us, we have the same facial expressions under the same circumstances. So, for example, if you tickle a chimpanzee, they produce laughing sounds like ha, 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 type sounds, and they have the same tickle spots, and they have the same facial expression. So yes, in the apes, that connection is very easily made, and that's also how Darwin wrote about the emotions. Darwin said, well, if the facial expressions of apes are very similar to ours and shown under the same circumstances, you have to assume that the emotions behind it are very similar too. Now, if you move away from the apes and you go to animals like dolphins, who don't have facial expressions, or elephants, or rats, or even further, you go to the octopus or whatever the animal is, it becomes more difficult. But you do see changed states. And so, for example, the octopus changes color, and certain color changes have to do with fear. Other color changes have to do with camouflage. Others have to do with imminent attack by the octopus. And so you see these color changes, which means that there's a change of the state of the animal. Is prepared for actions, for different kinds of actions. And usually we extrapolate and say, well, that means that the octopus is angry, so to speak. But it is, of course, a bit of a jump in the case of the octopus. In the case of the apes, it's much less of a jump.
It's interesting you use dolphins as an example of an animal that doesn't have a facial expression because, of course, to us, certainly to children, the dolphin always looks like it's smiling.
Yeah.
And again, you're warned, the dolphin isn't smiling, that's just its face, and going back to that danger of anthropomorphism. But what about this other danger that you talk about in the book of anthropo-denial? What does that mean?
Well, that's actually more serious in my mind, is that people deny the connection with animals. And so for a century, we heard from the behaviorists like Skinner and so on, who didn't like internal states and didn't want to talk about them. We heard, don't anthropomorphize the animals, so stay away from that. But as a result, we started using different terminology for animal behavior and human behavior. So, for example, if a chimpanzee laughs and makes these laughing sounds, we say it's vocalized panting. Or if chimpanzees kiss each other after a long absence, they kiss each other also during reconciliation. So very much the same context where we kiss each other. We say we're going to call that mouth-to-mouth contact or something. So we were always looking for a terminology that moved it away from human behavior. And as a result, we were denying the connections. And I think our language needs to respect the connections. And so if you don't do that, I call that anthropo-denial. We need to respect the connections in the same way that we would not call the front leg of a chimpanzee a front paw. We would call it a hand and an arm. That's how we call it, because it's very similar to the human hand and arm. And so in the same way that we respect the connections in the body of the chimpanzee, we need to do that in the behavior and in the internal states of the animal.
What emotions do animals have? I mean, that we have evidence that they experience.
Oh, I think basically all emotions. It would be easier to ask, what do we have that they don't have?
What they don't have, yeah.
And I have sort of given up on that, in the sense that I used to think that shame and guilt would be good candidates for that, as for typically human emotions, because they are so self-conscious. But, shame looks exactly like submission. Human shame is, you try to disappear into the ground, you slam your hands in front of your face, you don't look up. It's a very submissive display. And anthropologists who have studied shame all over the world, they say it is a bit of a submissive thing, in the sense that you submit to the hierarchy and to the conformity of the group in which you live. And so even something like shame is not disconnected from behavior that we see in animals, because in animals, of course, if an animal does something wrong, you also see that kind of reactions, and the dominants, they get angry at them and they react with that kind of behavior. So even for shame and guilt, in the book I discuss how I see the connections there. And I'm not convinced that humans are always feeling guilt when they say they feel guilt. I'm skeptical about humans too. And so even in those areas, usually the way I look at it is that we have these same emotions, and in some cases they are more elaborate. So we have made them more sophisticated, and we apply them maybe under a wider range of circumstances. But that doesn't mean that the emotion itself is necessarily different.
Well, let's flip that question again. Are there emotions that animals have that perhaps we don't have?
Well, that's very well possible. I think that has been speculated for cetaceans, which are the whales and dolphins, that given the structure of their brain and the certain areas in their brain, they may have a stronger bonding mechanism than even humans have. And that's why they are so tight together very often. So it is possible that certain emotions are more emphasized in certain species. Certainly you would think that prey species have more shades of fear than we do. They live in fear. The whole day they have to watch over their shoulder, which we don't necessarily need to do, and which predators like. That's why we like predators at home. We have dogs and cats at home. They are very self-confident creatures, obviously, because they're predators. But prey animals, they are much more nervous. So, for example, a horse is a much more nervous animal than a dog or a cat.
The title of your book, Mama's Last Hug, refers to a video that has been widely viewed online of a final encounter between Mama, an aging and very ill chimpanzee, and one of her caretakers, a scientist named Jan de Hoof. Tell us about that video.
So Mama is the alpha female of the Arnhem Zoo chimpanzee colony where I used to work. And so I've known her for 40 years. And actually, I gave her that name because she was like the mother of the group. She She really was a mediator and the alpha female, very influential character in the group. And she also was the one who, for the group, interestingly, maintained relationships with the humans at the zoo. It's a very large chimpanzee colony with more than 25 chimps. But she was the one who always nodded at you and tried to contact you and tried to groom with you and things like that. And we never went in with Mama. You never do that with an adult chimpanzee. But when she was dying at the age of 59, Jan van Hoof, my professor, biology professor in the Netherlands, he decided to say his goodbyes to her. And this was, I think, 2 weeks before she died. And so that was videotaped and on the internet. And many people looked at it, and many people were extremely moved by it.
Oh, it's impossible to watch without crying.
Yeah, it is a very tender moment where Jan van Hoof was probably a bit nervous going in, because we never go in with an adult chimp. And Mama was actually that was typical for her. She reassured him, she calmed him down. She embraced him and patted him on the neck and things like that. And what struck me afterwards is that people were moved. I could understand that, but that people were so surprised how human-like her behavior was. And that is something that stuck with me, like why are they surprised that a chimpanzee has human-like facial expressions, human-like gestures, like the patting on the back that she did? Why are they so surprised? And that's why I took it as the example at the beginning of the book and explained the life of Mama and how important she was, but also explain that this kind of behavior, these facial expressions and everything, that is perfectly normal behavior for the chimpanzee. And so there is basically no behavior that we show on a daily basis that you're not going to see in the chimpanzee. And so in terms of facial expressions and sounds and whatever they make.
What is the biggest misapprehension that most people have, those who are not in this field, about emotions and animals?
Well, I think one of the misunderstandings that I encounter is that people think you need to know the feelings behind the emotions. I consider feelings a separate issue. Feelings are private states. You can tell me your feelings, but I cannot really know them. You can say, I was sad at the funeral of my dad. How do I know that your sadness was like my sadness at the funeral of my dad? I may have felt totally different from you, but we both use the word sadness. So your feelings remain more or less inaccessible. And with animals, that's even more of an issue, of course, because in your case, I can extrapolate for myself. In animals, it becomes more difficult. And so we need to keep that separate. And so the misunderstanding that I see is that people think that if you study the emotions in animals, you try to know their feelings. I would love to know their feelings, but that's not necessarily the goal. Emotions are visible on the outside, are visible on the inside in terms of hormones and blood pressure and things like that. So emotions are perfectly measurable, but the feeling states remain private states.
What is the goal? Is there some perhaps solvable mystery that we still don't know about animals and emotions?
Oh, I think we've just started on the emotions in animals. And so since it was for such a long time a taboo topic, which is strange because Darwin wrote about the emotions without any problems. And then we got this very dark century, the previous century, during which we were not allowed to talk about internal states. And even in humans, the emotions were controversial. And it's only after the 1960s, I believe, that we openly discussed human emotions in psychology. So the emotions are a neglected topic. And now they are coming up big time, partly as a result of neuroscience. But I think we've only started on them. And so classifying the emotions and seeing what are the profiles in the brains of the emotions, how do you recognize them in a scanner, for example, in humans. All these things are just coming up. And so I think there are plenty of mysteries still left.
What's the one that most intrigues you? What do you most want to know?
Well, one of the things that always intrigued me is, because I studied reconciliation for such a long time, is that chimpanzees have a fight, and then after the fight, 10 minutes later, they come together and they kiss and embrace. I was always surprised how they could make that transition, even though as a human, of course, I'm very familiar with the transition from hostility to being friends again. But it is interesting that they can go from emotions like fear and aggression, which is what fighting is about, to more attraction and making up and forgiving. And so that whole process intrigues me always, because it's a sudden shift in your emotional state that you bring about yourself, basically, voluntarily. And so I would like to know more about that.
Well, hopefully you will find out, and they will then share their secret with many people who could probably use that information themselves.
Yeah, it's a very useful skill to have, yeah.
All right, Frans, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Frans de Waal is the author of Mama's Last Hug, Animal Emotions and What They Tell Us About Ourselves, reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So we're going to talk about some fun book deals, or maybe not fun.
Maybe not. Well, so yesterday, everyone in the country, including, I'll admit myself, even though I was on deadline, we were pretty much glued to the Michael Cohen hearing at the Capitol. And one thing that was interesting to follow as a publishing reporter was that this idea of his book deal came up so frequently. When Republicans were questioning Mr. Cohen, they frequently raised this notion that he was going to try to cash in on his proximity to President Trump with a book deal or a movie deal, but they brought it up over and over. I thought that was kind of a funny line of attack, but I also recalled, having spoken to publishers when he was in fact circulating an early proposal. And of course, any book deal that he gets now will be vastly different from what this proposal was. This was more of sort of inside look at Trump, sort of Trump's rise from a successful businessman to the highest office in the land. And I think it was going to be much more positive portrait of the president, whereas now, given his testimony and the other things that he's said publicly, obviously it would be a quite different story.
Well, I know that he has been circulating some kind of, or exploring the idea even as recently as a month or so ago, because I talked to one of his potential ghostwriters. He's been interviewing ghostwriters. But what I love about that story is that, like, they were asking about a book deal and not a movie deal or a TV deal. It's just interesting how central books have become to the kind of political story.
That was exactly the reaction I had. And there was sort of people jumping in on Twitter from the publishing world. You could see people saying, or journalists saying, I want a book deal. And other people saying, no, that's a crime now. You can't get a book deal, because they were portraying it in this very negative light. But it's true that obviously a ton of people close to the president have published books. Many of them have been big bestsellers. You have Comey's book, Andrew McCabe's book recently hit #1 on our nonfiction hardcover list. So there's this enormous public appetite for, insider views on the president. I think many people are still trying to figure out how he operates and how he rose to the levels he rose to. I think another interesting thing that we saw this week was there are publishers who are very interested in publishing the Mueller report, if it is in fact ever released publicly.
Right. How do they do these deals if they don't know if it's going to be released publicly, right?
So, often when these public reports are released, you don't have to acquire them. You don't have to pay for rights because they're public documents. And so you can actually do a pretty quick turnaround. And, given the publishing and printing technologies these days, you can get a book out, in a matter of weeks. And I think that's probably what some of these publishers are planning. So Skyhorse is one of the publishers that has expressed interest in publishing the Mueller report. If it is released publicly, again, that's still an open question. They have apparently already designed a cover and commissioned an introduction from the attorney Alan Dershowitz, who's been a supporter and defender of President Trump. He published a book with Skyhorse titled The Case Against Impeaching Trump. So that's interesting. And the other publisher that is sort of lining up to lead on this is Scribner. They are teaming up with the Washington Post to publish the Mueller report instantly as an ebook and paperback edition. They intend to publish the findings of Special Counsel Robert Mueller and also have an introduction by the Washington Post investigative journalists Rosalind Helderman and Matt Zapotowski. So they are prepared to do that as well. I wouldn't be surprised if Melville House also jumped in. They have published public reports before, including the torture report was one that they published, and they've sort of, I think, led the way in taking these public findings and putting them in into book form, which I think is a real public service because often these are, hundreds of pages and very extensive documents that we get sort of filtered through news reports or congressional hearings. But to be able to sit down as a citizen and read them cover to cover, I think is pretty powerful.
Yeah, I remember when Public Affairs was the first publisher. They were then an independent publisher to jump in and do the Starr Report, and it became a huge bestseller.
That was a
for
massive
them.
bestseller. And apparently so were the Watergate tapes. Those were published by Herman Graf Associates with a first printing of 350,000 copies, and there were orders for more than 500,000 copies. This is according to Publishers Weekly. And so Herman Graf is now an acquiring editor at Skyhorse, so he kind of has some experience in that. But I can imagine these books selling very well.
All right. Well, this is all a very natural segue then to a new book announcement from Dr. Seuss.
Yes. Well, why not end on a lighter note? When readers are done slogging through however many pages of the Mueller report, if they want to read a new book from Dr. Seuss that was in his archives, which is called Dr. Seuss's Horse Museum, is going to be released this fall by Random House Children's Book, his longtime publisher. They're going to have a first printing of 250,000 copies, so they're obviously expecting a big audience for this. And it's, I think, it reminds me of What Pet Should I Get, which was his most recent posthumously released book. And again, that had been discovered in the archives, and they had to sort of take certain steps to complete it in terms of choosing the colors and sort of taking it over the finish line. They had these editors who'd worked with him for many years who sort of understood how he worked, so they were able to do that. And I'll be very interested to hear what how complete Dr. Seuss's Horse Museum was, if they had to take any steps to flesh out the narrative or finish the illustrations in some fashion, or if it was pretty much a full text that he just chose not to publish at the time.
All right, let's end on one really important question that I hope you will answer, which is, what's your favorite Dr. Seuss book?
Oh, I love that question. Whew. So I read them all with my kids, and I loved Dr. Seuss when I was a kid. Green Eggs and Ham, it's still really fun to read. But I like reading the sleep book with them because it does work, especially all the yawns. So how about you?
I'm a Hop on Pop person.
Hop on Pop. That's
yeah,
cool.
There's some
That's
really good
great
runs
too.
in there. Closely followed, I would say, by Redfish, Bluefish.
Redfish, Bluefish.
All right. I'm seeing claps from our producer, Pedro. So we've clearly given the right answers. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan, Lovia Garake, and John Williams. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
So I'm going to start with Lovia because I want to say that this is not Lovia's last appearance on the podcast, but she is abandoning us. She is moving on up. She is going over to the New York Times Magazine, where she will be working as an editor on the amazing monthly kids editions, but she still has a pass to come to the Books Desk and read our books. And
Yes.
so may occasionally come and visit us. So what are you reading?
Thank you. It's very bittersweet, honestly. I hope it's not my last appearance, but
You could be a special guest star.
but I'm reading The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which I feel like, who doesn't really know about this book? It really made a splash when it came out in 2015. It was translated by Deborah Smith. And I was actually talking to Parl about sort of the ethics of translation when it comes to this particular novel and how Deborah Smith, oftentimes really her translation is an art in of itself, and it's a form of creativity. But to the book, I'm actually rereading this book. So I read it once and I moved through it very quickly. To be cliche, I felt like I honestly inhaled and devoured it. And now I'm going through it a second time, and I think that with knowing what's going to happen and understanding the trajectory of the main character, I feel like I'm having a more considered reading experience. It's interesting. It's not a book that really, because it's a 3-part drama about this woman who becomes a vegetarian and stops eating meat. And the first time I read it, I was sort of like, this is an act of protest. This is about female rage. This is about taking control in your life when you feel like parts of your life are uncontrollable. And now that I'm reading it a second time, and I think I'm taking a less literal interpretation of it, and I'm wondering and meditating on the passages where she becomes a vegetarian after having this really violent dream. It's really unclear. It's a very muddied dream that's very bloody, and it turns her off to meat and the idea of meat and eventually to eating, and she tries to turn herself into a plant, essentially.
As one does.
Yeah, right. A natural reaction to nightmares. But now that I'm rereading it, I'm really thinking about the dreams, the excerpts, the parts where Han Kang really sort of takes us into the mind of the main character. And I'm meditating on sort of what this book has to say about, not just about anger and rage, but also about violence and being human. And perhaps, the main character is not just turning her back on, sort of her familial and personal struggles, but on humanity itself. So that's all I have to say about it for now. I'm only 30 pages into my rereading, but it's amazing. So.
Well, points to Lovia for not reading a lot of passages, which I made the mistake of doing a couple of years ago on the podcast, and it was a bit gory for some listeners. Tina, are you reading anything violent?
I am not. I'm not reading anything violent. I'm actually reading Astrid Lindgren's War Diaries. She's the Pippi Longstocking author for people for whom the name sounds familiar, but they can't place her. These diaries, they were actually more like scrapbooks. They were handwritten daily entries of the war when she and her family were living in a suburb of Stockholm. But she also pasted in tons of newspaper and magazine clippings and family photos. And in Sweden, apparently, it was published as a facsimile. So you got to see all of that and got the context. The American edition basically just has the words, but they're fabulous. And I wanted to read a few things. I'll keep it quite short. I should say that I do have a fascination with civilian war diaries. I always have. I mean, most people have heard of the classic, Mary Chestnut's Civil War, which I adore. But there's something about reading what is going on the home front when you've had history class and read the history books about what was going on the front lines. And I let me just read a few passages, and I think you'll see what I mean. Today was Karin's 6th birthday. Karin is one of her children. Today the Germans reached the English Channel. And today summer arrived, wonderful and painfully lovely to take in with all one's senses. It really smelt like summer today. The air full of scents and the pale green of the leaves on the trees looking fabulous. That is the 21st of May, 1940. I'm going to skip forward now to September 5th, 1942. She says, the war is 3 years old. I've not celebrated its birthday. We've all found our attitude towards it to be gradually changing. We used to talk about it all the time. Now we see it as a necessary evil to be thought of and talked of as little as possible. What we really do talk about is how little meat we get on the ration and how many eggs we've managed to lay our hands on. Whether it'll be a cold winter, how many French beans we've managed to bottle, and so on in the same vein. To me, reading something like that, like how a family's, struggling to put vegetables on the table, like brings it home more clearly than reading about ration books. When the war ended, she said, this was August 15th, 1945. Today, the Second World War ended. Cessation of hostilities between Japan and the Allies, they announced on the news this morning. Imagine it finally ending at last. 6 years, give or take 2 weeks. How well I remember sitting in the park when hearing that the Germans had marched into Poland. That was a fine, warm day, and it's ended on a fine, warm day as well. I wonder whether things really are calm all around the globe, whether there are no bombs falling, no cannons firing, no warships sinking. How quiet and strange it would be if that were so. And I should add that she was not a published author at this point. Mm-hmm. She had not written Pippi Longstocking, although in the introduction to the book, her youngest daughter says that it was during this time when she began to tell bedtime stories that clearly became Pippi Longstocking. And after finishing this, I feel like I understand more where the story of a spunky, authority-defying child came from during these war deprivations. Before I came down here this morning, I also looked up our original review of Pippi Longstocking, and the reviewer started the review saying, this 9-year-old has escaped from all adult supervision. Anyway.
Red alert.
Red alert. I highly, highly recommend. It's a fast read. John, how about you?
I'm reading 2 memoirs. Actually, I just finished one, and I'm into the second one. The first one is called Kafka Was the Rage by Anatole Broyard, who was a longtime book critic for the New York Times. And it's an incomplete memoir, which is kind of frustrating because it's so great. But he died before he had a chance to finish it. And so I think there's a particularly long section about his father and the death of his father that he never got to write. And the book is definitely front-loaded in the sense that there's a 90-page section about his relationship in the village with this woman named Sherry and about love and creativity and finding himself and finding a vision of himself that isn't about his family. And it's terrific. And then the second part of the book, which is a little shorter, is about his relationship with various artists in the village and New York intellectual life. And it's also very good, but it's not quite the same. I do want to read, he's a great one-line writer. There are just so many terrific images in this book, lots of sentences I underlined, which I like to do. And this first one is very appropriate given what Tina was talking about. It's about war, and he talks about how 1946 was such a good time in the West Village, and he writes that a war is like an illness, and when it's over, you think you've never felt so well. And then other places, just in very snippy lines, he says, I just want love to live up to its publicity. And then
such a good one.
It's a great line. And then in another line, he says, I chased her like a man chasing his hat in a high wind, and she kept blowing away. And then there's this great paragraph where he opens a bookstore in the village for a bit. So I guess I particularly love this part because that's, if only we lived in a time when you could easily open a bookstore in the village. And he writes, there were people in the village who had more books than money, and I appealed to them in the literary quarterlies. Like someone buying a dog, I assured them that I'd give their books a good home. But it was an unhappy business because many of these people suffered from separation anxiety. Those who were depressed by letting their books go tended to devalue them, while others, who were more in the hysterical mode, asked such enormous sums that I knew it was their souls they were selling. Pricing an out-of-print book is one of the most poignant forms of criticism. I love that last line. And so I blew through that. It's only about, because it's unfinished, it's about 150 pages, and you could probably read it in an afternoon if you're dedicated to it. And now I'm about 50 or 60 pages into a memoir called Giving Up the Ghost by the novelist Hilary Mantel, which is unsurprisingly written a lot like a novel. It's so full of detail and great characterization. She is in her childhood at this point, and she's writing actually very humorously about how aware she was of things at 2 and 4 and 6, which I'm always amazed by because I have very little memory pre-kindergarten or so. And so she's in her childhood, but I know it's going to become also about, she's suffered very bad health throughout her life and had some strange health problems. And I think it's going to be a lot about that and also about the creative life because she is an interesting mind who believes that she sees ghosts, for instance, and other spectral things in the world, and she's terrific on that too. So I may talk about finishing that up at a future episode, but for now I'm loving it.
I read that a couple of years ago in Spain. I was there for the Festival Eñe, and which sounds like an incongruous thing to read there, but I had one of these great mini Picador paperback editions that can fit. It's like a tiny book, which is very handy for travel, I have to say.
Those are adorable. You have a very non-tiny book.
I have a non-tiny book. I'm going to talk a little long, but it is a long book. I mentioned it earlier that I was starting Master of the Senate by Robert Caro, and there's a lot to say about this, and I'm going to try to keep it at a minimum. I'm not quite done. I thought I would impress you all by reading it within the span of a week. Do not be impressed. I am not done. I'm around page 700 and was reading this morning about the death and aftermath of the death of Emmett Till. There are many moments in this book that really bring you to tears, and that was one of them. And I want to read one of the other ones that brought me to tears. But the sort of backdrop to this is I read the first two, one in high school, one in college, and it's been a long time. And I've basically forgotten all of it. The first was Path to Power, followed by Means of Ascent, which I think came out in 1990 or 1991. And then this one came out about 8 years ago. I think this was 2013, maybe, so not quite 8 years ago. But what this has done is really changed my impression of Lyndon Johnson. I, like probably most Americans, my impression of Lyndon Johnson stemmed primarily from the presidency. So it began with that incredibly horrifying and poignant photo aboard Air Force One, where you have Lyndon Johnson taking the oath next to Jackie in that bloodstained dress. And it's hard not to, tear up when you're looking at that photo. And then for me, from that point on, I was very forgiving of Lyndon Johnson for the Vietnam War. For me, it was largely circumstantial. It had to do with, the Democrats being accused of being soft on communism. And for me, he was a hero because of the war on poverty and because of civil rights legislation. Let me say this. When you read this book, which is dealing with his Senate years, pretty much the course of the 1950s. He is no hero. He is not only no hero, he is a villain. And it's very difficult for me to imagine how, in reading the fourth volume and then hopefully the fifth, how I'm ever going to idolize him in any way again, because he truly is terrible in this book. And the theme that runs throughout the whole book is race. It's looking at how this man, who is a creature of the South, grew up in the hill country in Texas and really was a Texas politician. Sorry, Tina, in the worst way. Not the nice, Tina Jordan version of Texas, but the, stole every election he won. And it is a book about power. It's about how you accumulate power, how you seize power, and how you create power where none existed. So the Senate, up until that point, had become kind of this sclerotic institution. Nothing changed. Nothing happened. It was dominated by the seniority system, which meant you had a bunch of geezers at the top, all controlling the committees in the Senate and ensuring that essentially no change ever took place. And particularly dominant was the Southern Bloc, which ensured that anything that anyone tried to do of a progressive nature was promptly squashed, including, in this book, essentially Truman's Fair Deal. It's very depressing because it makes you think of the world it might have been had certain legislation with regard to housing, fair housing, and poverty and education and civil rights been enacted as early as the 1940s, how different the world would have looked. So I do not feel kindly towards Lyndon Johnson in this book, and I want to read a couple of examples of especially terrible behavior on his part. But before I do that, I'll read something somewhat heartwarming. I should leave that to the end, right? But I'm not going to. I'm going to read that first, and then you'll grow to despise him as I do at this moment. So this is the description of the decision in Brown versus Board of Education in that moment. And it talks about May 17th, 1954, when the court rules unanimously in favor of Brown versus Board of Education. This is obviously the case that got rid of segregation in the schools. And in one paragraph, Bob Caro does so much to convey the emotion of the moment. And this is not the entire paragraph, but I'll start here. The court's Chief Justice, this is Earl Warren, understood, as Lyndon Johnson understood, the importance of unanimity, and Earl Warren had obtained it, even from Justice Stanley F. Reed of Border State, Kentucky. Reed, who had been the last holdout, was looking down the bench at Thurgood Marshall, who had led the fight in Brown, when Warren uttered the words, "So say we all." Reed, quote, was looking at me straight in the face because he wanted to see my reaction when I realized he hadn't dissented, the great black attorney would recall. The two men exchanged nods, barely perceptible, but there were tears on the justice's face. All across the United States, black men and women knelt to give thanks to God. I don't know about you, but I can't. I tear up at that. Okay, now to get you angry. This is actually a little bit funny. Johnson's just a real character. So Johnson was a first-class manipulator. So this is after he goes from being minority leader in the first half of Eisenhower's first term in office as president to being majority leader. And he's trying to persuade someone to work for him. This person, whose name is Jim Rowe, does not want to work for Johnson, and he does not want to work for Johnson because nobody wants to work for Johnson. He is, not surprisingly, a terrible boss, really abusive, makes Amy Klobuchar perhaps look like a gentle kitten. And so here we go. He is trying to get him to work for him. This is after his heart attack. During that first week of January, however, Johnson renewed his overtures with a new argument, and when Rowe refused this time, he wouldn't let it drop. "I wish you would come down to the Senate and help me," he said in a low, earnest voice. And when Rowe continued to refuse, using his law practice as an excuse, I said, "I can't afford it. I'll lose clients." He found that Johnson was telling other members of their circle how cruel it was of Jim to refuse to help to take a little of the load off a man at death's door. People I knew were coming up to me on the street, and saying, "Why aren't you helping Lyndon? Don't you know how sick he is? How can you let him down when he needs you?" Johnson had spoken to Rowe's law partner, Rowe found. To my amazement, Corcoran was saying, "You just can't do this to Lyndon Johnson." I said, "What do you mean I can't do it?" He said, "Never mind the clients. We'll hold down the law firm." Johnson had spoken to Roe's wife. One night, Elizabeth turned to me. "Why are you doing this to poor Lyndon?" Then Lyndon Johnson came down to Jim Roe's office again to plead with him, crying, real tears, as he sat doubled over, his face in his hands. He wept. "I'm going to die. You're an old friend. I thought you were my friend, and you don't care that I'm going to die. It's just selfish of you, typically selfish." Finally, Roe said, "Oh, God damn it, all right." And then as soon as Lyndon got what he wanted, Roe was forcibly reminded why he had been determined not to join his staff. The moment the words were out of Roe's mouth, Johnson straightened up and his tone changed instantly from one of pleading to one of cold command. "Just remember," he said, "I make the decisions. You don't." That gives you a sense. Okay, and then just one very last story, and I'll tell it briefly, but to me it captures so much about the man. This is a story of a guy named Leland Olds. I'd never heard of him. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him. Not a famous person now, but Caro does something so beautifully in this book, and I'll talk a little bit more about how he paces it maybe next time when I'm still reading it, which is he will home in on one short kind of narrative that captures something about the man and how he operated. And then he'll kind of pull out and go somewhere else entirely. But there's a chapter called Lyndon Johnson and the Liberal. And Leland Olds was what we might think of as just a good person, like a truly good man, a public servant. This is a man who is the son of a mathematics professor, studied math himself. He said, after graduating from college in 1912, "I searched for some pursuit which would have some effect toward mitigating the evil of poverty." So he goes into social work. He finds that doesn't quite work. He then turns to organized religion. He becomes a Presbyterian minister. He becomes a statistician. That doesn't quite work. He goes through sort of a number of ways trying to really figure out how to help the poor. And at a certain point, he becomes a journalist, and he covers labor. And he writes labor for a kind of trade publication that is picked up and carried in 180 different newspapers around the country. And eventually he finds himself, he realizes, you know what, I cannot truly solve poverty or really do anything.
So he runs a hedge fund.
Yeah, exactly, John. And then he starts a charter school. No, he decides he really needs to work from within. He joins the government. He becomes part of FDR's administration. And then later on, he becomes the chairman of the Federal Power Commission. Now, the Federal Power Commission is the organization that licenses and regulates the facilities that create power from natural resources. And the reason why he can enact change to this is that this is at a time in the 1940s when a huge number of farms and poor people around the country do not have access to electricity, to power. This can fundamentally change people's daily lives, to give them access and to make sure that that access is affordable. And you have, at this point, real monopolies controlling those resources, and those monopolies are controlled by companies in Texas. And Lyndon Johnson, who is an incredibly ambitious person, knows at this point that one day he wants to be president, and that if he wants to be president, he is going to have oil and gas in Texas behind him, funding him and helping support his efforts. And he knows that this guy, Leland Olds, is in the way because he is doing things these companies do not like. So when Leland Olds has to go through what would normally be a routine process of having his term renewed by the Senate, Johnson decides to take him down, and mostly does it from behind the scenes so that his hands don't get dirtied. But he basically out-McCarthy's McCarthy, before McCarthy's really on the scene, paints Leland Olds as a red in a very public way, because one of the papers that picked up Leland Olds' former columns from the 1920s was the Daily Worker. And so when he gets up there to testify before the Senate, he is accused of having worked for the Daily Worker and other damning things. And Bob Caro takes us through this whole drama, but the end result is that Leland Olds loses his job, is plunged into poverty, and it destroys him and destroys his family. And you just see the way in which Johnson had absolutely no consideration of this human being on the other side of his action, that this person was just a pawn on the chessboard that he took down in his sort of relentless drive to power.
It's like a Frank Capra movie without the happy ending.
There's no happy ending. I'm not at the happy ending. I mean, what will be interesting to me is I find it very hard at this point to imagine how does Lyndon Johnson get from this to the war on poverty and the civil rights legislation, because for some people it might not matter. Like, oh, well, he was the guy that got him done. It's like, it got it done. It's like Nixon in China. This is the one guy, the Southerner, who could have passed civil rights legislation in this country. And who cares if he truly believed it was the right thing to do? But for me, I care. Maybe it's idealistic, but I want to believe that his heart was somehow in it, that he had some kind of conversion experience. And I am not there yet, but I am on a chapter called The Compassion of Lyndon Johnson. So we'll see if I become persuaded.
Things are looking up.
Yeah.
Slightly. Not yet, John, not yet. Anyway, Tina, let's hear once again. What did you read?
Okay, so I read Astrid Lindgren's War Diaries, 1939 to 1945.
And Luvia?
The Vegetarian by Han Kang.
John?
Kafka Was the Rage by Anatole Broyard and Giving Up the Ghost by Hilary Mantel.
And I read, as everyone now knows at length, or am reading Robert Caro's Master of the Senate, the third volume in the Years of Lyndon Johnson. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.